3 children huddled in a storm cellar beneath the Kansas prairie weren't listed in the land deed, but the bank planned to auction them off with the wheat fields anyway, until William Firehorse and his wife Rebecca discovered that sometimes the most precious things come without papers, without names, and without anyone caring enough to claim them. The morning sun painted the Oregon Territory sky the color of old copper as Rebecca Firehorse knelt beside her herb garden, pressing seeds into the dark earth with hands that trembled not from cold, but from hope she could no longer afford to feel. 8 years of marriage to William had brought her many joys, but the one thing her heart craved most remained as elusive as morning mist over the Snake River. She had planted this garden every spring for the past 5 years, tending rows of medicinal plants her Modoc grandmother had taught her to cultivate, but no amount of traditional remedies could heal the emptiness that echoed through their 2-bedroom cabin.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
William found her there as he always did, dirt under her fingernails, and tears she thought she had hidden glistening in the early light. At 34, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had learned to navigate 2 worlds, speaking English to the bank officials and land agents, while maintaining the spiritual practices his father had passed down before the Modoc Wars scattered their people to reservation lands they had never chosen. His success as a horse trader had earned him respect among both native and white settlers, but respect couldn't fill the silence that had settled over their home like dust after a long drought. "The banker sent word," William said gently, settling beside his wife among the neat rows of sage and sweet grass. "There's land available in Kansas." Widow named Martha Kellerman died owing the bank more than her farm was worth. "They're selling everything together, livestock, equipment, buildings." He paused, watching Rebecca's face carefully. 800 acres of good wheat land, and they want it gone quick. "Price is fair, maybe more than fair." Rebecca looked up. From her planting, soil streaking her cheek where she had wiped away moisture. "Kansas is far from here. Far from everything we know." William nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what he was asking. "Maybe far is what we need. Maybe starting over somewhere new, building something that's just ours." He took her dirty hand in his calloused one. "Maybe children will come. Easier in a place that doesn't know our sorrow." The decision came not from logic, but from desperation dressed up as hope. They had tried everything their limited world offered. Doctors in Portland who spoke in clinical terms about Rebecca's difficulties, traditional healers who burned sage and spoke to spirits, even a traveling preacher who had promised that sufficient faith could move mountains and certainly heal a woman's womb. Nothing had worked, and at 29, Rebecca felt the walls of possibility closing around her like a trap. Kansas represented escape, a chance to fail differently in a place where no one knew the Firehorse name or counted the years they had waited for the sound of children's laughter. Within a month, they had sold their small ranch and loaded their possessions into a wagon William had reinforced for the long journey east. Rebecca packed her herbs carefully, wrapping the roots and dried leaves in soft cloth, while William selected 6 of his finest horses to bring as breeding stock for their new venture. The morning they left Oregon, Rebecca pressed her face against the wagon seat and watched the rolling hills of her childhood disappear behind them, carrying with it the graves of 3 babies who had never drawn breath and the dreams that had died with them. The trail to Kansas stretched before them like a prayer written in dust and stone. 2 months of rolling prairie, punctuated by river crossings and towns that looked identical in their rough-hewn desperation. William drove the wagon with the patience of a man who understood that some journeys changed you more than they moved you, while Rebecca walked beside their horses when the rutted road became too jarring for her to sit comfortably. They traveled with a small group of other settlers, safety in numbers being more important than speed in territory, where tensions between white homesteaders and displaced tribes could turn deadly without warning. Rebecca found unexpected comfort in the rhythm of the trail. Each day brought the same simple needs: water for the horses, food for themselves, shelter from weather that could shift from blazing heat to freezing rain in the span of an hour. There was no time to dwell on what they had left behind or what waited ahead, only the immediate demands of survival that occupied her hands and quieted her restless mind. She learned to read the sky like a book, identifying the clouds that promised relief and those that threatened destruction, skills that would serve her well in the years to come. William proved himself invaluable to their traveling companions, his knowledge of horses helping them navigate river crossings and his ability to trade fairly with the various tribes they encountered, ensuring their party's safety. Rebecca watched him work and remembered why she had fallen in love with him 15 years earlier, when he was still called William Little Wolf and she was Rebecca Standing Bear, two young people from neighboring bands who had found each other at a summer gathering that felt like another lifetime. The war had taken their original names and scattered their families, but it had also forged them into something stronger, something that could survive displacement and build new lives from the ashes of the old. As they crossed into Kansas, the landscape began to change in subtle ways that spoke to both of them. The grass grew taller and thicker, rippling in waves that reminded Rebecca of water, but extending to horizons that seemed impossibly distant. William noticed the quality of the soil, rich and black beneath the prairie grass, perfect for the wheat farming that had made Kansas legendary among homesteaders seeking their fortunes. This was land that could feed a family, support livestock, provide the kind of stable foundation they had never quite achieved in Oregon, where their small ranch had always felt temporary, borrowed against a future they couldn't guarantee. The Kellerman farm revealed itself gradually as their wagon crested a low rise 3 weeks into their Kansas journey. What they saw below them made Rebecca catch her breath, not from beauty but from the overwhelming evidence of dreams deferred and hope abandoned. The main house sat at the center of the property like a tired old woman, its white paint peeling in long strips that fluttered in the constant prairie wind. The barn leaned slightly to the east, its roof patched with mismatched boards that spoke of repairs made with whatever materials came to hand. Fencing stretched across the rolling wheat fields in crooked lines. Some sections collapsed entirely while others held together through determination and luck. William pulled the wagon to a stop near the house and studied the property with the calculating eye of a man who had learned to see potential beneath decay. "The bones are good," he said finally, noting the solid foundation stones and the way the buildings had been positioned to take advantage of natural windbreaks. "Whoever built this knew what they were doing. It just needs care, attention." Rebecca climbed down from the wagon seat and walked slowly toward the house, her practiced gaze taking in details William might miss. The kitchen garden had gone to weeds, but she could see the careful layout beneath the chaos. Rows that had once been precisely maintained, now overrun with volunteer wheat and prairie wildflowers. The bank agent who met them at the property was a nervous man named Horace Finch, all sharp elbows and prominent Adam's apple, who kept consulting a leather portfolio as if the papers might change if he looked at them frequently enough. "Mrs. Kellerman passed 6 months ago," he explained, leading them toward the house. "Natural causes, nothing concerning, but she'd been struggling with a mortgage for years. Husband died in '78, left her with more debt than assets." He paused at the front door, fumbling with a large key. She did her best to keep things running, hired help when she could afford it, but farming's hard work for a woman alone. Rebecca followed the men into the house, immediately struck by the silence that seemed to press against the walls like a living thing. The front room had been cleared of personal belongings, leaving only the heavy furniture that the bank considered part of the property. A horsehair sofa covered in faded blue fabric, a dining table scarred by years of use, chairs that had been carefully repaired multiple times.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
But it was the small details that caught Rebecca's attention. The careful needlework on the curtains, the way the floorboards had been scrubbed until they gleamed, the faint scent of lavender that suggested a woman who had taken pride in her home even as circumstances conspired against her. The property includes all buildings, equipment, and livestock, Finch continued, leading them through rooms that felt haunted by their emptiness. There's the main house, obviously, plus the barn, chicken coop, storm cellar, and a small cabin that Mrs. Kellerman used for storage. He paused in the kitchen, gesturing toward a cast-iron stove that dominated one wall. Everything's in working order, or near enough. You'll want to inspect it all carefully, of course, but the bank's eager to close the sale quickly. William nodded, already mentally cataloging the repairs that would be needed and the order in which they should be completed. The house itself was sound, built to withstand the fierce storms that swept across the Kansas prairie with regularity. But it would need new paint, fresh chinking between the logs, and a dozen small fixes that marked the difference between a structure and a home. Rebecca found herself drawn to the windows, imagining them filled with the warm light of evening meals and the sounds of family life that had been absent from her world for so long. The storm cellar wasn't mentioned in the bank's listing, and Horace Finch seemed surprised when William asked about it during their tour of the outbuildings. "Oh, that," he said dismissively, gesturing toward a wooden door set at an angle into a low hillside behind the main house. "All the farms out here have them, tornado shelters mostly. I suppose it comes with the property, though I can't imagine it's worth much." He started to move away, clearly considering the cellar beneath his notice, but William was already walking toward it with the thoroughness of a man who believed in examining every corner of land he might purchase. The wooden door was heavy and warped from years of prairie weather, requiring William's full strength to pull it open against rusted hinges that screamed in protest. Cool air rushed out from the darkness below, carrying scents of earth and root vegetables and something else, something that made Rebecca step closer with sudden attention. "There's a lamp down there," she said, pointing to a faint glow that seemed to flicker against stone walls. "Someone's been using this recently." Finch frowned, clearly troubled by this development. "That's impossible. The property's been empty since Mrs. Kellerman passed." William descended the rough wooden steps carefully, Rebecca close behind him, while Finch remained at ground level, muttering about trespassers and property rights. The storm cellar opened into a surprisingly large space carved from the solid earth, its walls lined with stone and its ceiling supported by thick wooden beams. Shelves lined the walls, still holding jars of preserved vegetables and sacks of grain that suggested someone had been maintaining Mrs. Kellerman's stores. But it was the arrangement of blankets in one corner, the small pile of books, and the careful organization of personal belongings that made it clear this space had become more than a storage area. "Hello?" Rebecca called softly into the shadows. Beyond the lamplight, "We're not here to hurt anyone. We're just looking at the property." The silence stretched for long moments, broken only by the sound of their own breathing and the distant whistle of wind across the prairie above. Then, gradually she became aware of other sounds, the soft intake of breath that wasn't their own, the rustle of fabric, the almost inaudible whisper of movement in the deeper darkness of the cellar. William raised the lamp higher, and the additional light revealed what Rebecca's instincts had already told her. 3 small figures pressed against the far wall of the cellar, their faces pale with fear and their clothes clean but well mended. The oldest was a boy who couldn't have been more than 11, his thin shoulders set protectively in front of a girl of perhaps 8 and a smaller boy who looked to be about 5. They stared at the adults with the wary intelligence of creatures who had learned that survival depended on making quick, accurate judgments about potential threats. "My name is William Firehorse," William said gently, keeping his voice low. "And calm. This is my wife, Rebecca. We're thinking about buying this farm from the bank." He paused, studying the children's faces. "What are your names?" The older boy stepped forward slightly, never taking his eyes off William's face. "I'm Matthew," he said, his voice steady despite his obvious fear. "This is my sister Grace and my little brother Billy. We're not doing anything wrong. We've been taking care of the place, keeping it clean like Mrs. Kellerman asked us to." Rebecca felt her heart clench at the sight of these three children, obviously alone, obviously struggling, but also obviously cared for despite their circumstances. Grace had clean hair braided neatly down her back, and Billy, though thin, had the bright eyes of a healthy child. Their clothes were patched but carefully mended, and the corner of the cellar they had claimed as their own was organized with the precision of people who understood that small spaces required careful management. "Where are your parents?" Rebecca asked, crouching down to bring herself closer to their eye level. The question seemed to cause the children physical pain, their faces tightening with something too complex for adults to easily decode. Matthew looked at his siblings, clearly weighing how much truth to share with these strangers who held their fate in their hands. "Our ma died last winter," he said finally. "Pa died when Billy was just a baby. We've been living with Mrs. Kellerman, helping with the farm work, but then she got sick and the doctor couldn't help her." His voice caught slightly. "She told us to stay here, that someone good would come eventually." William exchanged a look with Rebecca that communicated volumes without words. These children were orphans, alone in the world except for each other, surviving in a storm cellar because they had nowhere else to go. The implications were staggering and immediate. They were trespassing on bank property. They had no legal guardians. They were precisely the kind of problem that frontier justice solved quickly and without much concern for individual welfare. Above them, Horace Finch's voice carried down into the cellar with increasing agitation. "What's taking so long down there? Is there a problem with the foundation?" Rebecca looked up toward the rectangle of daylight that marked the cellar entrance, then back at the three children who waited for her response like prisoners awaiting a verdict. In that moment, she understood that her answer would determine not just whether she and William bought this property, but whether these children lived or died, whether they remained together or were scattered to whatever institutions existed to handle inconvenient young lives. "Mr. Finch," she called up to the bank agent, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart, "we need a few more minutes to examine the foundation stones. We want to make sure everything is structurally sound." It was a lie, but it bought them time to think, to figure out how to handle a situation that no one had prepared them for. William knelt beside the children, his large hands gentle as he examined their living arrangements with the eye of someone who understood survival. "How long have you been down here?" he asked quietly. Matthew bit his lip, clearly calculating whether honesty would help or hurt their cause. "Since Mrs. Kellerman passed," he admitted. "Maybe 4 months now. We've been keeping the farm running best we could, feeding the chickens, milking the cow, keeping the weeds down in the garden. We thought maybe if we took good care of everything, whoever bought the place might let us stay and work for them." It was the desperate logic of children who had learned too young that their survival depended on making themselves useful to adults who had no obligation to care about their welfare. Rebecca felt tears stinging her eyes as she realized the full scope of what these children had endured. 4 months alone, caring for a farm and each other, hiding in a storm cellar and hoping that kindness might still exist in a world that had given them precious little evidence of it. Grace stepped closer to her brother, slipping her small hand into his, while Billy pressed against Matthew's side with the unconscious trust of a child who had learned to depend completely on his older siblings for protection. "The bank doesn't know you're here," William said, and it wasn't a question. Matthew shook his head, confirming what William had already deduced. "We've been real careful. We only come out at night mostly, and when people come during the day we hide down here." We knew if the bank found us they'd send us away, maybe split us up. His voice broke slightly on the last words, revealing the fear that haunted all three children, that the family they had created through necessity and love might be destroyed by adults, who saw them as problems to be solved rather than people to be protected. Above them, Finch's patience was clearly wearing thin. "I have other appointments today," he called down. "If you're satisfied with the property, we should discuss terms." Rebecca looked at William, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his dark eyes. They had come to Kansas seeking a fresh start, a place where they might build the family that had eluded them in Oregon. Now they faced a choice that would define not just their future, but the future of three children who had no one else to speak for them. "We're interested in the property," William called up to Finch, his voice carrying authority that brooked no argument. "But we need to discuss some details about what exactly is included in the sale." It was a careful way of opening negotiations without revealing the complexity of what they had discovered. A way of buying time to figure out how to protect these children without putting them in greater danger. Rebecca gathered the three small figures closer to her, feeling for the first time in 8 years that she might be exactly where she needed to be. Horace Finch's impatience had transformed into visible agitation by the time William and Rebecca emerged from the storm cellar, their faces carefully composed to hide the turmoil churning beneath the surface. The bank agent consulted his pocket watch with theatrical precision, clearly intending to communicate his displeasure at their prolonged inspection of what he considered a minor outbuilding. "I trust everything meets with your approval," he said tersely, already gathering his papers, as if the sale were a foregone conclusion. "The bank is prepared to finalize the transaction today if you're ready to proceed." William exchanged a meaningful glance with Rebecca, both of them acutely aware that three children waited in the darkness below, their futures hanging on decisions that would be made in the next few minutes. "The property has potential," William said carefully, adopting the measured tone he used when trading horses with men who might try to cheat him. "But we've identified some concerns that need to be addressed before we can commit to the asking price." Finch's eyebrows rose sharply, clearly unaccustomed to negotiations that didn't favor the bank's position. "What sort of concerns?" "The listing clearly states that the property is being sold as is, with no warranties or guarantees." Rebecca stepped closer to her husband, presenting a united front as they prepared to navigate what might be the most important conversation of their lives. "We're wondering about the legal status of certain assets that might be associated with the property but weren't explicitly mentioned in your documentation." Finch's confusion was genuine, his narrow face creasing with the effort of trying to understand what these potential buyers were driving toward. "I'm not sure what you mean. The inventory is quite comprehensive. Livestock, farm equipment, household furnishings, all buildings and improvements." He rifled through his papers, searching for something he might have overlooked. "Perhaps you could be more specific about these alleged assets." William chose his words with the precision of a man walking across thin ice. "We're concerned about any legal obligations or responsibilities that might transfer with the property. Sometimes previous owners make informal arrangements that new buyers inherit, whether they know about them or not." The bank agent's expression shifted from confusion to suspicion, his years of experience with frontier property deals warning him that this conversation was heading toward complications he hadn't anticipated. "Mr. Firehorse, I assure you that this is a straightforward transaction. Mrs. Kellerman died intestate, with no living relatives to complicate the inheritance. Her debts exceeded her assets, which is why the bank is liquidating everything to recover what we can." He paused, studying William's face with the intensity of a man trying to read signs in an unfamiliar language. "If you're concerned about some sort of hidden liability, I can provide additional documentation, but I must warn you that the bank's patience has limits." Rebecca realized that their careful approach was creating more problems than it solved. that Finch's growing suspicion might lead him to investigate the property more thoroughly and discover the children himself. She made a decision that surprised both men. Stepping forward with the directness her grandmother had taught her was sometimes the only path through dangerous territory. "Mr. Finch, we found 3 children living in the storm cellar. Orphans, who have been caring for the property since Mrs. Kellerman's death. We need to understand what legal obligations we might inherit regarding their welfare before we can proceed with the purchase." The silence that followed Rebecca's revelation stretched across the prairie wind like a held breath, broken only by the distant sound of grasshoppers and the creak of the barn's weathered boards. Finch's face cycled through a spectrum of emotions: surprise, calculation, irritation, and finally a kind of weary resignation that suggested this wasn't the first time his straightforward property deals had been complicated by human elements the bank preferred to ignore. "Children," he repeated slowly, as if testing the word's weight. "Living in the storm cellar. For how long?" William watched the bank agent's reaction carefully, trying to gauge whether honesty had been the right strategy or potentially catastrophic. "Mistake. They claim to have been there since Mrs. Kellerman passed," Rebecca continued, pressing forward now that the truth was in the open. "They're not trespassers or vagrants. They were apparently helping with the farm work, and Mrs. Kellerman was providing them with shelter and care in exchange." She paused, allowing Finch to process this information. "The oldest boy says she told them to wait for someone good to come along, someone who might need their help as much as they needed a home." It was a romanticized version of what Matthew had actually said, but Rebecca understood that bank agents responded better to narratives that minimized legal complications rather than highlighted them. Finch removed his spectacles and cleaned them with mechanical precision, a gesture that bought him time to think while maintaining the appearance of calm professionalism. "This is highly irregular," he said finally. "The bank had no knowledge of any children on the property. If Mrs. Kellerman was providing them with shelter, it was an informal arrangement with no legal standing." He replaced his spectacles and consulted his papers again, as if hoping to find some clause that would make this problem disappear. "Technically, they're trespassers now, regardless of any previous arrangement. The bank could have them removed by the county sheriff." The casual way Finch discussed having the children removed sent a chill through Rebecca that had nothing to do with the prairie wind. She had grown up hearing stories of what happened to orphaned children in frontier communities, how they were often treated as burdens to be disposed of rather than lives to be protected. What would happen to them if the sheriff removed them from the property? She asked, though she dreaded the answer. Finch shrugged with the indifference of a man whose job was to liquidate assets, not solve social problems. County orphanage. Most likely. Though at their ages, they might be placed with families willing to take them as laborers. The older boy especially would be useful on a farm. William felt his jaw clench at the casual way Finch discussed the children's futures, reducing them to their potential labor value as if they were livestock to be evaluated for breeding or work capacity. His own childhood memories of the reservation system, of government officials who spoke about native children in similarly detached terms, made him acutely sensitive to the dehumanizing language of bureaucratic efficiency. And if someone were willing to take responsibility for them as part of purchasing the property, he asked quietly, what would that require legally? Finch's expression sharpened with interest, recognizing the possibility of a solution that would eliminate his problem while still completing the sale. That would be highly unusual, the bank agent admitted, but not necessarily impossible. You would need to petition the county court for guardianship, demonstrate that you have the means to provide for their care, and undergo an investigation to ensure their welfare. He paused, clearly calculating the additional paperwork and delays this would involve. The process could take months, and there would be no guarantee of approval. The court tends to favor established orphanages over individual families, especially for multiple children. Rebecca felt her heart sink at the mention of months-long legal processes and uncertain outcomes, but William's expression remained carefully neutral, unable to proceed with the property purchase until the children's situation was resolved. William and Rebecca spent the remainder of the afternoon in the storm cellar, gradually coaxing the full story from three young people who had learned to trust carefully and speak sparingly about their past. Matthew proved to be the most forthcoming, his role as protector requiring him to evaluate potential allies and threats with adult-level sophistication. He explained that their mother had died during the previous winter's influenza outbreak, leaving them alone in a world that had no official provisions for orphan children beyond the county poorhouse. "Mom made us promise to stay together, no matter what," Matthew said, his voice carrying the weight of a vow that had shaped every decision he'd made for the past year. She knew what happened to kids who got split up by the county. Some disappear completely, sent to work farms where nobody checks on them. Others get placed with families who just want free labor. Grace nodded solemnly, her 8-year-old face bearing an expression far too serious for her age. "Mrs. Kellerman found us sleeping in her barn about a week after Ma died. We thought she'd send us away, but instead she brought us into the house and gave us chores to do." Billy, the youngest at 5, had been largely silent during their initial encounter, but gradually warmed to Rebecca's gentle questions and patient attention. His memories of their mother were fragmentary but precious, centering around songs she had sung and stories she had told during the long Kansas winters when outdoor work was impossible. "Ma said we were prairie flowers," he said quietly, growing wild and strong where other things couldn't survive. Rebecca felt tears sting her eyes at this innocent repetition of what must have been his mother's attempt to help her children see strength rather than abandonment in their circumstances. The children's account of their time with Mrs. Kellerman painted a picture of an elderly woman who had understood loneliness intimately and recognized it in 3 small faces that appeared at her door seeking shelter. She had been widowed for several years, struggling to maintain a farm that required more physical strength than she possessed. When Matthew, Grace, and Billy arrived like an answer to prayers she hadn't known she was praying. The arrangement had benefited everyone. The children received food, shelter, and the security of adult protection, while Mrs. Kellerman gained willing helpers who could handle the daily chores that had become increasingly difficult for her aging body. "She taught me to read better," Grace said proudly, producing a worn primer from among their carefully organized possessions. "And she showed me how to preserve vegetables and make soap from lion fat." Matthew's contributions had been more physically demanding, caring for the livestock, maintaining fences, helping with the wheat harvest that provided the farm's primary income. Even Billy had found ways to contribute, gathering eggs from the chickens and helping Grace with the vegetable garden that supplied much of their food. It had been, by all accounts, a functional family unit held together by mutual need and genuine affection. Mrs. Kellerman's decline had been gradual but inexorable, the children explained, marked by increasing fatigue and a persistent cough that worsened throughout the spring. She had refused suggestions that she see a doctor, claiming that medical attention cost money she didn't have, and that frontier medicine had little to offer elderly women with worn-out bodies. Instead, she had focused on preparing the children for what she seemed to understand was coming, teaching them skills they would need to survive independently, and making them promise to trust in the fundamental goodness of people, even when circumstances suggested otherwise. The night before she died, Matthew said quietly, she called us to her bedside and made us promise 3 things. First, that we'd always take care of each other no matter what happened. Second, that we'd keep the farm running as best we could until someone came who needed it as much as we needed them. And third, that we'd never let anybody convince us we weren't a real family just because we weren't born to the same parents. His voice broke slightly on the last words, and Grace immediately moved closer to him, offering the wordless comfort that siblings provide in moments of overwhelming emotion. Rebecca found herself deeply moved by the children's loyalty to Mrs. Kellerman's memory and their determination to honor promises made to a dying woman who had shown them kindness when the world offered little else. Their story revealed not just the harsh realities of frontier life for the vulnerable, but also the unexpected ways that families could form when traditional structures failed to provide for basic human needs. These three children had created something precious and resilient in the face of abandonment and loss, something that deserved protection rather than bureaucratic dismantling. William's initial inquiries into the legal requirements for taking custody of the children revealed a labyrinthine system designed more to protect institutions than to serve individual needs. Kansas territorial law required prospective guardians to prove their moral fitness, financial stability, and ability to provide proper care for minor children, standards that were interpreted differently depending on the prejudices and preferences of local officials. The fact that William was Native American, despite his success as a horse trader and his integration into the white community, would likely complicate their application in ways that were never explicitly stated, but always understood. The county courthouse in Dodge City housed records that painted a discouraging picture of previous guardianship cases involving multiple children. Most applications were denied outright, with judges preferring to place children in established orphanages or divide siblings among different families willing to take individual children as laborers or domestic help. The few successful cases involved prominent white families with extensive community connections and documented Christian faith, criteria that William and Rebecca might struggle to meet despite their genuine desire to provide a loving home. Rebecca's inquiries among the local women's church auxiliary revealed additional layers of complexity that formal legal documents didn't address. Social expectations in frontier communities were rigid and unforgiving, particularly regarding families that deviated from established norms. A Native American man and his white wife taking custody of 3 orphan children would be subject to scrutiny and gossip that could make their lives difficult regardless of the legal outcome. Some women expressed doubts about whether mixed-race families could provide proper moral guidance, while others questioned whether the children would be better served by placement with more suitable families. The financial requirements alone seemed designed to discourage all but the wealthiest applicants. Prospective guardians needed to demonstrate not just current income sufficient to support additional family members, but also liquid assets that could cover unexpected medical expenses, educational costs, and emergency situations. William's assets were primarily tied up in land, livestock, and equipment, forms of wealth that frontier judges sometimes viewed with suspicion when evaluating urban-based legal standards. The irony was that successful farmers often possessed exactly the kind of practical wealth that could support children, but in forms that didn't translate easily to legal documentation. Perhaps most troubling was the discovery that Kansas territorial law contained provisions allowing courts to separate siblings if judges deemed it in their best interests, a phrase that could be interpreted to justify almost any decision that simplified administrative responsibilities. Matthew, Grace, and Billy's fierce devotion to each other, their determination to remain together despite every obstacle, could be overruled by officials who viewed family bonds as inconvenient complications rather than precious relationships worth preserving. The very love that made them a family could be dismissed as irrelevant by a legal system that prioritized efficiency over emotional welfare. Word of the Firehorse family's discovery spread through the local community with the speed that only small-town gossip could achieve, carried from the general store to the church social to the weekly Grange meeting in a matter of days. Reactions varied widely, revealing the complex social dynamics that govern frontier communities where individual privacy was nearly impossible, and community approval could determine a family's success or failure. Some neighbors expressed genuine sympathy for the children's plight and admiration for William and Rebecca's willingness to take responsibility for them, while others questioned the wisdom of encouraging what they saw as irregular family arrangements. The Local Methodist minister, Reverend Samuel Crawford, paid a visit to the Kellerman property within a week of the story becoming public knowledge. He was a thin, earnest man in his 40s who had come west to bring civilization to the frontier, and often struggled with the gap between his theological training and the harsh realities of prairie life. His conversation with William and Rebecca revealed both genuine concern for the children's welfare and deep uncertainty about whether their proposed guardianship met the moral standards his congregation expected him to uphold. "I don't question your intentions," Reverend Crawford said carefully, accepting Rebecca's offer of coffee while the 3 children played quietly nearby. "But I must consider the implications for the broader community. Marriage between races is still controversial, and adding orphan children to such a union raises additional questions about proper moral guidance." William listened to this diplomatic expression of prejudice with the patience born of long experience. Recognizing the coded language that frontier officials used to express concerns they couldn't state directly. "Are you suggesting that our children would receive inferior moral instruction because of my heritage?" he asked quietly. The minister's discomfort was visible as he struggled to articulate concerns that sounded reasonable in private conversations but seemed petty when stated openly. "Not inferior, necessarily, but different. These children come from Christian families, and the community has expectations about their continued spiritual development." Rebecca felt her temper rising at the implication that her husband's spiritual beliefs were somehow inadequate, but she forced herself to respond with the diplomacy that frontier survival required. "William and I both believe in the importance of spiritual guidance for children. We would ensure that Matthew, Grace, and Billy continued their Christian education if that's what the community requires." Local opinions were further complicated by practical considerations that had little to do with moral judgments. The children had been successfully maintaining the Kellerman farm for months, demonstrating skills and work ethic that many adults envied. Matthew's ability to manage livestock, Grace's competence in domestic tasks, and even young Billy's contributions to daily operations made them valuable assets to any farming operation. Some neighbors expressed concern that allowing the Firehorse family to adopt the children would remove them from the local labor pool, making them unavailable for hiring during peak agricultural seasons when extra hands were desperately needed. The most surprising support came from an unexpected source: Martha Henley, the stern widow who ran the local school and had a reputation for brooking no nonsense from children or parents. She appeared at the farm one afternoon carrying a basket of teaching materials and wearing an expression that suggested she had something important to say. "I've been teaching frontier children for 20 years, she announced without preamble, "and I've never seen 3 youngsters better prepared for education despite their circumstances. That oldest boy reads at a level most 12-year-olds never achieve, and the girl has mathematical skills that put some of my older students to shame." Mrs. Henley's endorsement carried significant weight in the community because of her reputation for strict standards and honest assessments. Her willingness to vouch for the children's character and abilities provided a counterweight to the concerns expressed by others, creating a more balanced public discussion about the proposed guardianship. "These children have been raising themselves and maintaining a farm simultaneously," she continued. "That demonstrates exactly the kind of responsibility and family commitment that our community claims to value. If we can't support that, what exactly are we supporting?" Her blunt question forced neighbors to confront the contradictions in their own stated values. Horace Finch's patience with the complicated situation finally reached its breaking point. 3 weeks after the initial property viewing, when he arrived at the farm with an ultimatum that threatened to destroy any chance of a peaceful resolution, the bank, he announced, had decided that the children's presence on the property represented a liability that could no longer be tolerated. Either William and Rebecca would complete the property purchase immediately and assume full legal responsibility for the children, or the bank would have them removed by county authorities and proceed with selling the property to other buyers. who had expressed interest. "I've tried to be accommodating," Finch said, mopping his brow with a handkerchief despite the cool morning air. "But the bank's board of directors is concerned about the legal implications of allowing minors to remain on property we're attempting to sell. If something happened to them while they're technically our responsibility, we could face lawsuits that would far exceed any profit from this transaction." His nervousness was genuine, reflecting real pressure from superiors who viewed human complications as obstacles to efficient business operations rather than moral responsibilities requiring careful consideration. William studied the bank agent's face, recognizing the desperation of a man caught between competing pressures with no good options available. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Finch? We've already explained that the legal guardianship process could take months, and we can't complete the property purchase until we know whether we'll be allowed to keep the children." Finch shifted uncomfortably, clearly dreading the response his proposal would receive. "The bank is prepared to complete the sale immediately if you'll sign documents, acknowledging that the children are your responsibility regardless of any future legal proceedings. Essentially, you would be purchasing them along with the property." The silence that followed this suggestion was heavy with implications that none of the adults wanted to acknowledge directly. Finch's proposal would make the children legally equivalent to livestock or farm equipment, assets that transferred with the property rather than human beings with rights and needs requiring proper legal protection. It was a solution that satisfied the bank's desire for clean paperwork, while completely ignoring the children's welfare and the Firehorse family's need for legitimate guardianship status. "You're asking us to buy human beings," Rebecca said, quietly, her voice carrying a tone that made Finch flinch visibly. "That's not how I would phrase it," the bank agent protested weakly, recognizing that his suggestion sounded even worse when stated plainly. "It's more of a practical arrangement to resolve an unusual situation. The children need homes, you want to provide them with care, and the bank needs to complete this transaction. This approach eliminates the bureaucratic delays while achieving everyone's primary objectives." William's expression had hardened into something that reminded Finch uncomfortably of stories he'd heard about Indian warriors who had fought the cavalry to protect their families. "Mr. Finch, my people have some experience with being bought and sold like property. I will not subject these children to the same treatment, regardless of how you choose to phrase the arrangement." The confrontation might have escalated into something uglier if not for Matthew's sudden appearance from the house, where he had apparently been listening to the conversation through an open window. The 11-year-old walked directly to William and Rebecca, positioning himself between them and the nervous bank agent with a composure that seemed far beyond his years. "Mr. Finch," he said politely, "we appreciate everything you've tried to do to help us, but we'd rather take our chances with the county authorities than be sold like cattle. We're not property, and we won't let anyone treat us that way." The boy's dignity in the face of dehumanizing treatment shamed the adults into a moment of uncomfortable silence, broken only by the sound of Grace and Billy joining their brother on the porch with expressions that mirrored his determination. These three children, who had survived abandonment, death, and months of uncertainty, were prepared to face whatever consequences their refusal might bring rather than compromise. Their fundamental human dignity, their courage in the face of adult failures, provided a stark contrast to the moral cowardice that Finch's proposal represented. 3 days after Horace Finch's ultimatum, a dust cloud on the horizon announced the arrival of Sheriff Tom Bradley and his deputy, riding hard toward the Kellerman farm with the grim determination of men carrying out unpleasant but necessary duties. William spotted them first from the barn where he was repairing harness leather, and his shout brought Rebecca running from the vegetable garden where she had been working alongside Grace to salvage what remained of Mrs. Kellerman's plantings. The children seemed to vanish into the landscape with the practiced efficiency of young people who had learned that survival sometimes depended on becoming invisible when authority figures appeared. Sheriff Bradley was a weathered man in his 50s whose 20 years of frontier law enforcement had taught him to distinguish between genuine criminals and people caught in circumstances beyond their control. He dismounted slowly, his arthritic joints protesting the long ride from Dodge City, and approached William and Rebecca with the careful neutrality of someone who understood that his next few words would determine whether this encounter remained civil or escalated into something uglier. "Mr. and Mrs. Firehorse," he said formally, touching the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. "I'm here on official business regarding 3 minor children reported to be living on this property without proper guardianship." William stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Rebecca in a protective gesture that was more instinctive than calculated. "Sheriff, we've been working with the bank and the county to resolve the children's legal status. They're not in any danger, and they're certainly not being mistreated." Bradley nodded slowly, his experienced eyes taking in the well-maintained farm buildings, the organized household, and the obvious signs that this was a working operation rather than a place of neglect or abandonment. "I'm sure that's true, Mr. Firehorse, but the law is clear about custody requirements for minor children. Without proper guardianship papers, these youngsters are considered wards of the county." Rebecca felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized that the moment they had dreaded was finally upon them. All their careful planning, their hopes for legal adoption, their dreams of becoming a family, could be destroyed by bureaucratic procedures that treated children like administrative problems to be solved rather than human beings with feelings and needs. "Sheriff Bradley, these children have been through enough trauma. They've lost their parents, they've been caring for themselves and this farm for months, and they've finally found stability with us. Surely the law allows for some consideration of their emotional welfare." The sheriff's expression softened slightly at Rebecca's plea, revealing the conflict between his official duties and his personal sympathy for the family situation. "Ma'am, I understand your feelings, and I can see that you and your husband mean well. But I've got direct orders from Judge Morrison to bring these children to the county facility, pending a proper custody hearing." He paused, clearly uncomfortable with what he had to say next. "The judge is concerned about reports that irregular arrangements are being made outside the proper legal channels. He wants to ensure that the children's best interests are being protected." Matthew emerged from behind the barn with the quiet courage that had sustained him through months of uncertainty and fear. At 11 years old, he carried himself with a dignity that made the adults suddenly aware of their own moral failures. Walking directly toward the sheriff with his shoulders squared and his chin raised in unconscious imitation of his adoptive father's bearing. "Sheriff Bradley," he said politely but firmly, "we respectfully request that you don't separate our family. We've been taking care of each other long before Mr. and Mrs. Firehorse found us, and we've been taking care of this farm too. We're not a burden on anyone, and we're not causing any trouble." Grace and Billy appeared from wherever they had been hiding, flanking their older brother in a show of solidarity that spoke more eloquently than any legal argument about the bonds that held them together. Grace carried the worn Bible that Mrs. Kellerman had given her, while Billy clutched a wooden horse that William had carved for him during their first week together. These small possessions represented the continuity of love and care that had sustained them through loss and uncertainty, tangible symbols of the family relationships that bureaucratic procedures threatened to destroy. Sheriff Bradley found himself facing a moral dilemma that his years of law enforcement had not prepared him to handle. Before him stood 3 children who were clearly healthy, happy, and well cared for, asking not for rescue from abuse or neglect, but for protection from a legal system that would separate them from people who loved them. His deputy, a younger man named Pete Harrison, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, obviously troubled by the contrast between their official mission and the reality of what they had found at the farm. What happened next would become legendary in the local community, though the full story would not emerge until years later when the participants felt safe enough to speak openly about their actions. As Sheriff Bradley struggled with his conscience and his duty, neighbors began arriving at the farm with a coordination that suggested careful planning rather than coincidence. Martha Henley, the schoolteacher, appeared first with a basket of books and an announcement that she had come to assess the children's educational needs. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the circuit physician and coincidentally Judge Morrison's younger brother, arrived shortly afterward, claiming he needed to verify the children's health status before any custody decisions were made. The Methodist minister, Reverend Crawford, rode up during the doctor's examination with news that his congregation had voted to provide character references for the Fire Horse family's guardianship application. His presence carried particular weight because frontier judges often relied heavily on religious endorsements when evaluating moral fitness, and his willingness to support a mixed-race family represented a significant evolution in his thinking. Since his initial reservations, "I've had time to pray about this situation," he told Sheriff Bradley quietly, "and I believe these children are exactly where God intends them to be." More surprising was the arrival of 3 prominent local farmers whose wives had apparently organized them into what amounted to a character witness army. These were men who had initially expressed skepticism about the Firehorse family's ability to provide proper care, but who had been won over by evidence of the children's obvious well-being and the genuine love that radiated from this unconventional household. "Tom," said Jonas Carpenter, addressing the sheriff by his first name in the familiar way of men who had known each other for decades, "these folks have been nothing but good neighbors since they arrived. The children are healthy, happy, and contributing members of our community." The most unexpected support came from an elderly Osage woman named Mary Standing Bear, who arrived driving a small cart pulled by a paint horse that appeared to be older than she was. Her presence created a stir of curiosity among the gathered neighbors, many of whom had heard stories about her legendary knowledge of traditional healing and her reputation for speaking truth regardless of its popularity. She approached William directly, speaking to him in a mixture of English and what sounded like Modoc phrases, creating a conversation that excluded the white observers while clearly carrying great emotional weight for both participants. "This woman says you are her grandson's friend from the old days," Mary Standing Bear announced to the assembled crowd, switching to English with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "She says you helped her family during the Troubles. After the war, shared food when government promises proved empty, provided horses when agents tried to keep our people from traveling to visit relatives." Her weathered face creased into something that might have been a smile. "She says any man who protects Indian children will certainly protect white children, and any woman who accepts Indian children into her heart has room for all children." Sheriff Bradley found himself surrounded by a community that had mobilized to protect the Firehorse family with a speed and efficiency that suggested this was not their first experience with collective resistance to unjust authority. The neighbors had not gathered spontaneously. They had been organized by a network of women who understood that sometimes moral law superseded legal law, and that decent people had obligations that transcended official procedures. Mrs. Gladys Murphy from the general store had apparently served as the communication hub, using her position at the center of local commerce to coordinate timing and talking points. Judge Harrison Morrison was a Massachusetts-educated lawyer who had come west seeking adventure and fortune, but had found instead the daily challenge of applying Eastern legal principles to frontier realities that defied easy categorization. When Sheriff Bradley returned to Dodge City with reports of community support for the Firehorse family's guardianship claim, Morrison faced a political problem that threatened to undermine his authority regardless of how he ruled. Siding with the family would anger county officials who preferred institutional solutions to individual complications, while ruling against them would alienate prominent community members whose support he needed for re-election. The judge's personal inclinations favored the family, partly because his own brother's medical report described the children as remarkably healthy and well-adjusted. and partly because his legal training had taught him to be suspicious of bureaucratic solutions that prioritized administrative convenience over individual welfare. However, territorial law provided little precedent for the kind of informal guardianship arrangement that had evolved at the Kellerman farm, leaving Morrison to navigate uncharted legal territory where his decisions would establish precedents for future cases. Morrison's research into Kansas territorial statutes revealed a complex patchwork of laws that had been written by legislators who never anticipated the practical challenges of frontier family life. Provisions for orphan children assumed the existence of established institutions and extended family networks that simply didn't exist in newly settled territories, while guardianship requirements were based on urban models that poorly fit agricultural communities where children were expected to contribute economically to family survival from an early age. The political dimensions of the case became clearer when Morrison received a visit from Territorial Representative James Hartwell, an ambitious politician whose support for statehood depended on demonstrating that Kansas could maintain civilized social order despite its frontier conditions. Hartwell expressed concern that allowing irregular family arrangements would create precedents that undermined legal authority and encouraged similar challenges to established procedures. "Judge Morrison," he said carefully, "the territory's reputation for law and order is crucial to our statehood application. We cannot afford to appear lenient toward arrangements that circumvent proper legal channels." However, Morrison also received pressure from an unexpected source, his own wife, Margaret, who had become involved with the local women's auxiliary and had heard detailed accounts of the fire-horse family situation from neighbors who had witnessed their interaction with the children firsthand. Margaret Morrison was a formidable woman whose social connections and political instincts had contributed significantly to her husband's career advancement, and her support for the family carried weight that extended far beyond personal opinion. "Harrison," she said firmly over dinner one evening, "sometimes doing the right thing requires ignoring the convenient thing." The custody hearing was scheduled for a sweltering Thursday morning in late July when the courthouse felt like an oven and the assembled crowd spilled out onto the wooden sidewalks of Dodge City's Main Street. Judge Morrison had intended the proceedings to be brief and administrative, but the arrival of more than 40 community members transformed the hearing into something resembling a town meeting where multiple constituencies competed to influence the outcome. The Firehorse family sat in the front row with Matthew, Grace, and Billy between them, the children dressed in their best clothes and displaying the kind of quiet dignity that impressed even skeptical observers. Horace Finch testified first, presenting the bank's position with the nervous efficiency of a man who understood that his employer's interests were not universally popular. He described the discovery of the children as a complication that had later routine property sale, emphasized their lack of legal guardianship, and suggested that institutional care would provide more appropriate oversight than private arrangements. His testimony was factually accurate, but emotionally sterile, focusing on procedural requirements while ignoring the human dimensions of the situation. The children's testimony proved far more compelling than any adult's legal arguments. Matthew spoke with the articulate precision of someone who had learned that words carried life or death importance, describing their experiences with Mrs. Kellerman, their months of independent survival, and their hopes for remaining together as a family. Grace's quiet answers to the judge's questions revealed a maturity that impressed the courtroom, while Billy's simple statement that he loved his new parents brought tears to several observers' eyes despite his young age. Dr. Morrison's medical testimony provided crucial evidence of the children's physical and emotional well-being under the Firehorse family's care. He described Matthew's healing from malnutrition that had occurred during their months of independence, Grace's recovery from a respiratory condition that had improved with proper care, and Billy's normal development despite the trauma of losing his parents at such a young age. "Your Honor," he concluded, These children are thriving in their current situation in ways that institutional care could not replicate. Martha Henley's educational assessment carried particular weight because of her reputation for academic standards and her experience with frontier children whose schooling was often interrupted by family circumstances. She testified that all 3 children were reading above grade level, that Matthew showed exceptional aptitude for mathematics and natural sciences, and that Grace displayed artistic talents that deserved cultivation. These children have received better educational support in their unconventional family than most receive in traditional arrangements. She stated firmly, "The most dramatic moment came when Mary Standing Bear rose to address the court in a mixture of English and traditional phrases that required translation, but carried emotional power that transcended language barriers." She spoke about the bonds that held families together across cultural and racial lines, about the responsibility of communities to protect their most vulnerable members, and about the damage that bureaucratic procedures could inflict when they prioritized rules over relationships. Her presence reminded everyone that family structures had been evolving on the frontier for generations, often in ways that challenged official assumptions about proper social organization. Judge Morrison's decision reflected both legal precedent and political calculation, establishing temporary guardianship for the Fire Horse family while requiring them to meet specific conditions that would demonstrate their fitness for permanent custody. The children would remain with William and Rebecca for a 6-month probationary period during which county officials would make regular visits to assess their welfare, educational progress, and social adjustment. At the end of that period, a final hearing would determine whether the arrangement should be made permanent. The courtroom erupted in applause from the community members who had supported the family, while county officials maintained the stony silence of bureaucrats who had been forced to accept a compromise that satisfied no one completely. The children's relief was visible in their faces, though Matthew's expression suggested he understood that their victory was temporary, and that the next 6 months would be crucial to their family's survival. Rebecca found herself crying with a mixture of joy and anxiety, grateful for the judge's decision but aware that they now faced the challenge of proving themselves worthy of the trust that had been placed in them. The probationary period began immediately, with the announcement that County Supervisor Eleanor Whitman would conduct the first inspection within 2 weeks. Mrs. Whitman was known throughout the territory for her rigid adherence to regulations and her skepticism toward unconventional family arrangements, making her selection as supervisor a clear signal that the county intended to monitor the Firehorse family with exceptional scrutiny. Her reputation for finding fault with even the most conscientious families created an atmosphere of nervous anticipation that hung over their celebration like a storm cloud. William and Rebecca returned to the farm with mixed emotions, grateful for the legal protection they had won, but acutely aware that their real work was just beginning. The children seemed to understand instinctively that their behavior during the probationary period would determine their family's fate, and they threw themselves into farm work and household responsibilities with an intensity that was both admirable and heartbreaking. Matthew took on additional chores without being asked. Grace spent extra time on her reading and arithmetic, and even young Billy tried to help with tasks that were clearly beyond his physical capabilities. The community support that had emerged during the hearing continued throughout the summer, with neighbors finding excuses to visit the farm and observe the family's interactions for themselves. These visits served multiple purposes. They provided opportunities for informal character assessment that could be shared with county officials. They offered practical assistance with agricultural tasks that required more hands than the family could provide. And they demonstrated ongoing community investment in the family's success. Mrs. Murphy, from the general store, made regular deliveries of supplies that somehow never required immediate payment, while Reverend Crawford established a weekly Bible study session that provided religious instruction for the children while allowing him to monitor their spiritual development. The first county inspection arrived precisely on schedule, with Mrs. Whitman appearing at the farm in a black buggy, driven by a grim-faced assistant who carried a leather portfolio thick with forms and assessment criteria. Eleanor Whitman was a formidable woman in her 60s whose 30 years of social work had convinced her that most people were inadequate parents and that children were generally better served by institutional care than by the emotional messages of family relationships. Her inspection would be thorough, objective, and potentially devastating to a family whose unconventional structure already made them suspect in her professional judgment. The inspection lasted 6 hours and covered every aspect of the family's life, from the cleanliness of the living quarters to the quality of the children's clothing to the content of their educational instruction. Mrs. Whitman questioned each child separately about their treatment, their daily routines, their feelings about their placement, and their understanding of their legal status. She examined their sleeping arrangements, their food storage, their medical care, and their recreational activities with the methodical thoroughness of someone looking for evidence to support predetermined conclusions. Matthew's interview with Mrs. Whitman lasted nearly an hour and covered topics that seemed designed to elicit complaints about his treatment or expressions of dissatisfaction with his current situation. The 11-year-old answered each question with careful honesty, describing his responsibilities around the farm, his relationship with William and Rebecca, and his hopes for the future with a maturity that seemed to surprise the county supervisor. When she asked whether he missed his previous life or wished for different arrangements, Matthew's response was simple and direct. "Ma'am, this is the first time since our ma died that we felt like we belonged somewhere." Grace's artistic abilities became a particular focus of Mrs. Whitman's attention, partly because creative pursuits were sometimes viewed with suspicion by officials who believed children should focus on practical skills, and partly because her drawings revealed emotional insights that could be interpreted in various ways. The 8-year-old had created a series of pictures showing the family working together around the farm, images that radiated happiness and security, but that could also be seen as idealized representations that masked underlying problems. Mrs. Whitman studied these drawings with the intensity of someone searching for hidden meanings. Billy's youth made his interview the most challenging for Mrs. Whitman, who struggled to extract meaningful information from a 5-year-old whose primary concerns involved his wooden horse and the barn cats he had befriended. However, his unconscious comfort with both William and Rebecca, his easy assumption that they would protect and provide for him, and his obvious physical health and emotional stability provided evidence that was difficult to dismiss regardless of her professional skepticism about unconventional family arrangements. Eleanor Whitman's first inspection report to the county contained 18 specific criticisms of the Firehorse family's guardianship arrangements, from minor housekeeping issues to concerns about the children's excessive emotional attachment to their foster parents. Her recommendations included increased supervision, mandatory weekly visits from county officials, and the immediate enrollment of all 3 children in the Dodge City boarding school, where their proper socialization could be monitored by qualified professionals. What the family didn't know was that Whitman had already decided their arrangement was unsuitable and was systematically building a case for the children's removal. The boarding school requirement proved particularly devastating because it would effectively separate the family for 10 months of every year, allowing the children to return to the farm only during summer breaks when agricultural work was at its peak. Matthew understood immediately that this arrangement was designed to weaken their family bonds and prepare the children for eventual placement in separate homes. His quiet conversation with William and Rebecca that evening revealed a maturity that broke their hearts. "They're trying to make us forget we belong together. If we go to that school, we'll come back different people who don't need each other anymore." Rebecca's investigation into the boarding school revealed an institution that prioritized discipline and conformity over individual development, where children were forbidden to speak their native languages, practice traditional customs, or maintain connections to family members who didn't meet the school's standards for appropriate influence. The prospect of subjecting Matthew, Grace, and Billy to an environment designed to strip away their cultural identity and family loyalty filled her with a rage that surprised her with its intensity. William's attempts to negotiate alternative educational arrangements met with bureaucratic stonewalling that suggested a coordinated effort to force compliance with Whitman's recommendations. The local school board claimed they lacked authority to override county directives, while church officials who had previously supported the family suddenly discovered concerns about their ability to provide adequate religious instruction. Even Martha Henley, the schoolteacher who had testified on their behalf, found herself under pressure from county officials who questioned her judgment and threatened her teaching certification. The campaign of harassment escalated when County Inspector Robert Kessler began making unannounced visits to the farm at inconvenient times, arriving during meals to critique the children's table manners, interrupting their lessons to question their educational progress, and examining their living quarters with a magnifying glass, intensity that suggested he expected to find evidence of neglect or abuse. His reports consistently found fault with arrangements that had functioned smoothly for months, creating a paper trail of complaints that could justify more drastic interventions. The psychological pressure on the children became evident in subtle changes to their behavior that only people who loved them would notice. Grace began having nightmares about being taken away from her family, while Billy started hoarding food in his bedroom as if preparing for another period of starvation. Matthew's response was more complex. He became obsessively helpful around the farm, working from dawn to dusk in a desperate attempt to prove his family's worth to officials who had already decided they were inadequate. The crisis that would determine the family's fate arrived in early September when a prairie fire, started by lightning and fed by drought conditions, swept across the Kansas grasslands with terrifying speed. William spotted the smoke first while checking fence lines in the early morning, recognizing immediately that the wind, direction, and fire's intensity posed a mortal threat to their farm and everything they had built together. His shouts brought Rebecca running from the house, and within minutes the entire family was mobilizing for what every prairie dweller understood might be a fight for their lives. Prairie fires moved faster than horses could run, consuming everything in their path with an appetite that seemed almost supernatural in its voracity. The Firehorse family had perhaps 2 hours before the flames reached their property, time that would need to be divided between saving their livestock, protecting their buildings, and potentially evacuating to safer ground. William's experience with fire management during his childhood on the reservation proved invaluable as he organized their defense, while Rebecca coordinated the children's efforts with the calm efficiency of someone who understood that panic was a luxury they couldn't afford. Matthew proved his worth during the crisis by taking charge of the livestock evacuation, herding their cattle and horses toward the creek bottom where water and sparse vegetation might provide protection from the advancing flames. His ability to remain calm under pressure and make quick decisions about which animals could be saved impressed even William, who had initially worried that the 11-year-old might be overwhelmed by the responsibility. Grace and Billy worked together to carry household valuables to the storm cellar, focusing on documents, photographs, and personal items that would be impossible to replace if the house burned. Rebecca's decision to remain at the farm while other families evacuated reflected both her commitment to protecting their home and her understanding that abandoning their property during the crisis would provide Eleanor Whitman with additional ammunition for her removal campaign. If the county could argue that the Firehorse family was unable to protect the children during emergencies, their guardianship would be terminated immediately regardless of any other considerations. The choice to stay and fight was simultaneously practical and symbolic, representing their determination to defend their family against both natural disasters and bureaucratic threats. The actual firefighting required skills and equipment that the family had acquired through months of prairie living, but had never expected to need under such desperate circumstances. William and Matthew worked together to clear fire breaks around their buildings using plows and shovels, while Rebecca and Grace soaked burlap sacks in the well water and positioned them strategically to protect vulnerable structures. Billy's job was to monitor the wind direction and alert the others to changes that might require adjusting their defensive strategy. As the fire approached their property, the sky turned an ominous orange that made midday seem like twilight, while ash fell like snow and the air became almost too thick to breathe. The roar of the flames grew louder than thunder, punctuated by the explosive sounds of trees igniting and the terrified cries of wild animals fleeing before the advancing inferno. The family worked in grim silence, their faces covered with wet cloths, their eyes streaming from smoke, their movements coordinated by weeks of living and working together as a unit. What happened next would become legendary in local folklore, though the participants would always insist they had simply done what neighbors do for each other during emergencies. Despite the danger to their own properties and families, more than 20 men from the surrounding area converged on the fire. Horse farm with plows, water barrels, and the kind of coordinated firefighting expertise that only prairie communities possessed. Jonas Carpenter arrived first with his 2 older sons, followed by Dr. Morrison driving a wagon loaded with medical supplies, and then a steady stream of neighbors who had decided that this family was worth risking their lives to protect. The volunteer firefighters included several men who had initially opposed the Firehorse family's guardianship of the children, their presence representing a fundamental shift in community attitudes that had occurred gradually over the summer months. Watching William, Rebecca, and the 3 children work together with such obvious love and dedication had convinced even skeptical neighbors that this was a real family worth preserving, regardless of the bureaucratic complications that surrounded their legal status. Sheriff Bradley appeared with his deputy and a crew of men from Dodge City, bringing professional experience with fire management and additional equipment that multiplied the community's defensive capabilities. His presence carried particular significance because county officials would be watching his response to the crisis, looking for evidence that he supported or opposed the family's continued existence. By risking his own safety to help them fight the fire, Bradley was making a public statement about where his loyalties lay when forced to choose between bureaucratic directives and human decency. The firefighting effort revealed aspects of prairie community life that were normally hidden beneath the surface of daily social interactions. Men who rarely spoke to each other worked side by side with perfect coordination, their shared understanding of fire behavior and defensive techniques, creating an efficiency that no amount of formal organization could have achieved. Women appeared, as if by magic, with food, water, and medical supplies, while older children took charge of younger ones to keep them safe and out of the way. Martha Henley's arrival with a wagon full of wet blankets and her own firefighting experience surprised everyone, including herself. The elderly schoolteacher had never considered herself physically capable of the kind of manual labor that prairie firefighting required, but her determination to protect the children she had taught overrode her concerns about personal safety. Her participation in the community effort represented a public endorsement of the Firehorse family that would carry significant weight with county officials who respected her professional judgment. Mary Standing Bear appeared near Sunset driving her ancient cart and carrying bundles of traditional herbs that she claimed would help treat smoke inhalation and burns. Her knowledge of prairie fire behavior, gained through decades of living on the land before white settlement, proved invaluable in predicting how the flames would move and where defensive efforts should be concentrated. Her presence also provided a cultural bridge between William's native heritage and the predominantly white community that had rallied to support his family. The fire reached the Firehorse property just as the sun was setting, creating a hellish landscape where day and night seemed to merge into something beyond natural experience. The flames rose 30 feet into the air, driven by winds that seemed to change direction with malicious intent. While the heat became so intense that men working the fire lines had to rotate every few minutes to avoid collapse from exhaustion and dehydration. The sound was indescribable, a combination of roaring, crackling, and explosive pops that made verbal communication nearly impossible. William positioned himself at the most dangerous point in their defensive line, where the fire was likely to make its strongest assault on their buildings. His experience with controlled burns during his reservation years had taught him to read fire behavior like a language, anticipating where flames would jump gaps and where they might be turned aside by carefully constructed barriers. Matthew worked beside him with the determination of someone fighting for everything he had ever loved. His small hands blistered from handling wet sacks, but his spirit unbroken by the physical demands of the battle. Rebecca coordinated the water brigade with the efficiency of a general commanding troops, ensuring that the men fighting the flames had a steady supply of wet burlap and that the most vulnerable structures received constant protection. Grace and Billy worked with her in perfect synchronization, their months of helping with farm chores having prepared them for exactly this kind of emergency cooperation. The sight of this small family fighting together against overwhelming odds inspired the volunteer firefighters to push themselves beyond what they had thought possible. The crisis moment came when the wind shifted unexpectedly, driving flames directly toward the main house where the family's most precious possessions were stored. For a terrifying few minutes, it seemed certain that everything they had built together would be consumed. But William's quick thinking and the community's coordinated response managed to turn the fire away from the buildings and toward the plowed fire breaks where it could be contained. The victory was temporary and exhausting, but it demonstrated that human determination could prevail against natural disasters when ordinary people chose to act with extraordinary courage. Dr. Morrison worked throughout the night treating smoke, inhalation, burns, and exhaustion among the firefighters, his medical expertise keeping several men conscious and functional when they might otherwise have collapsed. His presence provided both practical assistance and symbolic support, representing the professional community's endorsement of the Firehorse family's struggle for survival. His brother the judge would certainly hear detailed accounts of the evening's events, including descriptions of how well the children had performed under pressure and how completely they had been accepted by their neighbors. The fire was finally contained near midnight, leaving behind a blackened landscape that stretched to the horizon but had miraculously spared the Firehorse farm buildings and most of their livestock. The exhausted firefighters gathered around Rebecca's kitchen table for coffee and sandwiches, their faces streaked with soot, but their expressions reflecting the deep satisfaction that comes from successful collective action. The children moved among the men, serving food and expressing gratitude with a natural grace that impressed everyone present. Eleanor Whitman's appearance at the farm the following morning created a moment of tension that threatened to overshadow the previous night's victory. The county supervisor had driven out from Dodge City to assess fire damage and had expected to find either a destroyed property or a family that had abandoned their responsibilities during the crisis. Instead, she discovered buildings that had been successfully defended, livestock that had been skillfully protected, and evidence of community support that challenged her assumptions about the Firehorse family standing among their neighbors. What Whitman didn't expect was to find Sheriff Bradley still at the farm, having spent the night helping with cleanup efforts and ensuring that no hidden fires remained to threaten the property. His presence forced her to acknowledge that county law enforcement had actively supported the family during their crisis, making it difficult for her to argue that they were unsuitable guardians or that their arrangement lacked community approval. Bradley's obvious respect for William's firefighting expertise and his comfortable interaction with all three children provided evidence that contradicted her previous reports. The schoolteacher Martha Henley remained at the farm as well, having volunteered to assess any damage to the children's educational materials and to provide temporary instruction if their books and supplies had been destroyed. Her presence served multiple purposes. It demonstrated ongoing professional support for the family's educational arrangements. It provided an independent witness to observe their interactions during a stressful period, and it created an opportunity for informal assessment of the children's resilience and adaptability. Dr. Morrison's medical examination of the children after their night of firefighting revealed youngsters who were tired but unharmed, who had responded to crisis with maturity beyond their years, and who showed no signs of the trauma or dysfunction that Whitman's reports had suggested. His professional opinion, delivered in Whitman's presence, was that the children demonstrated exactly the kind of family stability and emotional security that county policies were supposed to promote. Matthew's leadership during the emergency, Grace's helpfulness under pressure, and Billy's calm trust in his family's protection painted a picture of successful child development that was difficult to dismiss. Jonas Carpenter's detailed account of the Fire Horse family's performance during the fire provided testimony from a respected community member whose initial skepticism about their guardianship arrangement was well known. His description of William's expertise, Rebecca's organization, and the children's contributions emphasized that this was a functional family unit that had proven itself under the most demanding circumstances possible. "Mrs. Whitman," he said bluntly, "if you can't see that these children belong with these parents after what happened last night, then you're not looking at the same family the rest of us are." Mary Standing Bear's presence added a cultural dimension to the mornings, discussions that Whitman found difficult to navigate. The elderly native woman's obvious respect for William and Rebecca, combined with her detailed knowledge of the children's progress and development, provided evidence of extended family support that transcended racial and cultural boundaries. Her willingness to speak on the family's behalf carried particular weight because of her reputation for honesty and her lack of any obvious ulterior motives. The combination of successful crisis management, demonstrated community support, and professional endorsements created a situation that Eleanor Whitman found impossible to dismiss or explain away through bureaucratic maneuvering. Her intended case for removing the children from the Fire Horse family's care had been systematically undermined by evidence that they were not only thriving in their current situation, but had actually excelled during emergency conditions that tested their family bonds and individual capabilities. Whitman's private conversation with Sheriff Bradley revealed her growing uncertainty about the wisdom of pursuing her original plan to recommend the children's removal to boarding school. Bradley's first-hand account of the family's performance during the fire, combined with his professional assessment of the community support they enjoyed, suggested that forcing their separation would face significant local resistance and might not serve the children's best interests. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "sometimes the law's purpose is better served by recognizing success than by enforcing failure." The children's own responses to Whitman's questioning that morning provided the most compelling evidence of their emotional stability and family attachment. Matthew spoke articulately about his experiences during the fire, demonstrating leadership qualities and family loyalty that impressed even the skeptical supervisor. Grace's artwork from the previous evening, sketched while waiting in the storm cellar, showed images of family members working together rather than the anxiety and dysfunction that Whitman had expected to find. Billy's simple statement that he had never been scared because his family was with him carried an emotional truth that professional training had not prepared her to dismiss. Dr. Morrison's unofficial conversation with Whitman during her visit provided crucial medical evidence that the children's development under the Fire Horse family's care exceeded normal expectations for youngsters who had experienced their level of early trauma. His brother's position as the judge who would make the final custody decision added weight to his professional opinions, while his personal observation of the family's interactions during the crisis provided insights that no amount of paperwork could match. The most significant development came when Whitman discovered that several prominent families in Dodge City had approached county officials with offers to provide character references for the Firehorse family's permanent guardianship application. These were not sympathetic neighbors or casual acquaintances, but respected community leaders whose support carried political weight that county supervisors ignored at their own peril. The emerging consensus seemed to be that the Firehorse family represented exactly the kind of stable, productive household that frontier communities needed to encourage. Martha Hemley's educational assessment provided the final piece of evidence that Whitman needed to justify revising her recommendations. The children's academic progress under Rebecca's instruction exceeded what most frontier schools achieved, while their practical skills and emotional maturity demonstrated the benefits of family-based education combined with real-world responsibility. Her professional opinion was that removing these children from their current educational environment would constitute educational malpractice that violated their fundamental right to appropriate instruction. Eleanor Whitman's second report to the county represented a complete reversal of her previous recommendations, though she crafted the language carefully to avoid acknowledging that her initial assessment had been flawed. She described the Firehorse family's successful crisis management as evidence of their parental competence, cited community support as proof of their social integration, and recommended that their temporary guardianship be converted to permanent status with minimal additional supervision. The children, she concluded, were receiving care that met or exceeded county standards and were developing into productive young citizens who would benefit both their family and their community. The report's impact on county officials was immediate and decisive, removing the bureaucratic obstacles that had threatened the family's stability and clearing the way for Judge Morrison to approve their permanent guardianship application. Whitman's professional reputation for thorough assessment and conservative judgment made her endorsement particularly valuable, while her detailed documentation of the family's strengths provided legal justification for a decision that both moral sentiment and political calculation supported. William and Rebecca received news of the report's contents through unofficial channels before the formal notification arrived, giving them time to process the magnitude of what they had achieved and to prepare the children for the changes that permanent guardianship would bring. The knowledge that their family's legal status was finally secure allowed them to begin planning for a future they had barely dared to imagine, while the children's relief was visible in subtle changes to their behavior that reflected the lifting of psychological burdens they had carried for too long. The community's response to news of the favorable report demonstrated how completely the Firehorse family had been accepted into the social fabric of their neighborhood. Congratulations came in the form of practical gifts, tools for expanding their farm operation, books for the children's education, and household items that recognized their permanent status as community members. The support that had begun as emergency assistance during the Prairie Fire had evolved into the kind of ongoing neighborly cooperation that sustained frontier communities. Judge Harrison Morrison's courtroom overflowed on the December morning when the Firehorse family's permanent guardianship hearing was scheduled, with spectators spilling into the corridors despite the bitter Kansas winter wind. The assembled crowd represented a community's investment in a family whose story had become interwoven with their collective identity. Eleanor Whitman sat in the front row with her revised recommendations, while Sheriff Bradley positioned himself near the door with quiet authority. Matthew, Grace, and Billy entered wearing new clothes that Rebecca had sewn from fabric donated by the church ladies, their appearance reflecting both modest prosperity and community support. At 12, Matthew carried himself with dignity that impressed court officials, while Grace's quiet confidence and Billy's trusting demeanor provided visible evidence of children who had found security in a world that had initially offered them none. Judge Morrison's opening remarks acknowledged the unusual nature of the case and the precedent his decision would establish. His legal training demanded adherence to established procedures, but frontier experience had taught him that rigid application of Eastern laws could produce outcomes serving neither justice nor community welfare. The courtroom fell silent as He began reviewing evidence that would determine whether 3 orphan children would remain with the people they had learned to call parents. Eleanor Whitman's testimony represented a complete reversal of her original position, delivered with professional credibility that made her endorsement particularly valuable. She described her extensive evaluation of the Firehorse family's home environment, the children's educational progress, their physical and emotional development, and their community integration with clinical precision. Her recommendation for immediate permanent guardianship carried the weight of county authority behind what had once been a controversial arrangement. The children's own testimony proved more articulate and moving than any adult's legal arguments. Matthew spoke with measured precision, describing their journey from orphan desperation to secure belonging with maturity that left few dry eyes in the courtroom. Grace's simple account of learning to read with Rebecca's patient instruction, and Billy's innocent declaration that he finally had a real family provided emotional truth that transcended legal technicalities. Judge Morrison's decision to grant permanent guardianship was delivered with unusual personal commentary revealing his emotional investment in the case's outcome. He spoke about the frontier's unique challenges, the evolution of family structures in response to practical necessities, and legal institutions' responsibility to serve human needs rather than bureaucratic convenience. His formal declaration that Matthew, Grace, and Billy Firehorse were now legal members of their adoptive family marked the end of months of uncertainty. The courtroom erupted in applause that continued for several minutes, despite the judge's attempts to restore order, while the Firehorse family embraced with tears of relief and joy. The children's transformation from frightened waifs hiding in a storm cellar to confident young people surrounded by community support represented a victory extending far beyond their individual circumstances. The celebration spilled into Dodge City's streets, where news of the family's legal victory spread with remarkable speed. Local businesses offered congratulations through practical gifts, while families who had supported the Firehorses gathered to share their triumph. The Methodist Church organized an impromptu reception where community members could express their joy at the positive resolution. Rebecca found herself overwhelmed by neighbors who had become extended family through their shared investment in her children's welfare. The women who had organized testimony, the men who had risked their lives fighting the Prairie Fire, and officials who had chosen human decency over bureaucratic expediency had created a support network that would sustain the Firehorse family. For generations, William's quiet gratitude reflected both his cultural background and understanding of how much their success depended on factors beyond their control. His ability to bridge Native and white communities had been crucial to their legal victory, along with frontier neighbors' willingness to accept his family despite racial prejudices that could have destroyed their chances. The months following their legal victory allowed the Firehorse family to focus on building the stable, productive life they had dreamed of during uncertainty. William's expansion of their horse trading operation provided financial security, supporting not just immediate needs, but long-term goals for the children's education and farm development. His reputation for honest dealing made him a valuable intermediary in business relationships requiring cultural sensitivity. Rebecca's establishment of a small school in their renovated barn addressed educational needs of frontier children whose families lived too far from town for established institutions. Her combination of formal academic instruction with practical skills training reflected frontier realities while maintaining standards that prepared students for advanced education. Martha Henley's endorsement provided professional credibility that attracted families throughout the county. Matthew's development into a skilled farm manager exceeded even William's optimistic expectations, as natural intelligence combined with practical experience created capabilities rivaling those of adults with years more experience. His leadership during the Prairie Fire had revealed qualities frontier communities particularly valued: courage under pressure, family loyalty, and ability to inspire others. At 13, neighbors already consulted his judgment about livestock. and agricultural matters. Grace's artistic talents found expression through Rebecca's encouragement and community recognition of beauty's importance even in harsh frontier environments. Her sketches of prairie life, family scenes, and community events became treasured possessions among neighbors who commissioned her work. Rebecca's decision to provide art supplies, despite their modest budget, reflected understanding that creativity was as essential as practical skills. Billy's growth from a traumatized 5-year-old into a confident, happy child demonstrated the healing power of stable family relationships and community acceptance. His easy friendship with neighboring children, unconscious assumption that adults would protect him, and natural curiosity provided daily evidence of successful recovery from early trauma. The Firehorse family's successful adoption inspired other frontier families to consider taking responsibility for orphaned or abandoned children who might otherwise have been lost to institutional care. Their example demonstrated that unconventional family arrangements could thrive when supported by community acceptance and legal recognition, creating precedents influencing custody decisions throughout the territory. Eleanor Whitman's transformation from skeptical bureaucrat to family advocate reflected broader changes in child welfare attitudes the Firehorse case had catalyzed. Her revised assessment procedures emphasized family stability and community integration over rigid adherence to predetermined criteria, while training programs for other supervisors incorporated lessons from frontier family dynamics. The Methodist Church's official endorsement led to broader discussions about Christian responsibility for orphaned children and the Church's role in supporting unconventional families, demonstrating Christian values through actions rather than adherence to traditional structures. Reverend Crawford's sermons about the family's journey became legendary throughout the territory. Sheriff Bradley's support during their legal struggles established him as a law enforcement officer, prioritizing human welfare over bureaucratic convenience, enhancing his reputation and leading to his eventual appointment as territorial marshal. His example influenced other frontier lawmen to consider broader implications of their decisions. The Firehorse family's legal victory created conditions allowing them to expand their household when twin brothers aged 7 and 9 were orphaned by cholera the following spring. William and Rebecca didn't hesitate to offer shelter and eventually adoption. Their experience had taught them that love multiplied rather than divided when shared among more family members. The addition of Samuel and David Crawford required practical adjustments but provided opportunities for older children to develop nurturing abilities. Matthew's mentorship of the younger boys, Grace's patient instruction in domestic skills, and Billy's generous sharing demonstrated how completely they had internalized values of family loyalty and mutual support. Rebecca's surprising pregnancy the following year completed their household in ways none had anticipated. Whether from the relaxation of finally having security or simple medical fortune, baby Sarah Firehorse's arrival strengthened rather than complicated family bonds. As older children embraced their baby sister with protective devotion, William's property expansion to accommodate their growing family reflected both financial success and confidence in their permanent community place. Additional buildings and expanded operations provided employment for neighboring families, while establishing the Firehorse Ranch as one of the county's most prosperous operations. 20 years later, the fire that had tested the Firehorse family's courage became the foundation story their children and grandchildren would tell for generations. The prairie around their ranch bore scars from that fire, but also new growth that had emerged stronger and more resilient than what had been destroyed. Matthew Firehorse's appointment as county agricultural agent reflected both his frontier farming expertise and reputation for honest dealing with families from all backgrounds. His marriage and establishment of an adjacent ranch created a multi-generational community anchoring the local economy. His leadership during subsequent crises drew directly on lessons learned during his childhood adoption, Grace Fire Horse's development into a renowned artist whose frontier paintings were displayed in galleries from Kansas City to San Francisco represented talents that might have been lost without a family willing to nurture creativity alongside practical skills. Her marriage to a circuit judge and establishment of a legal practice specializing in adoption law created professional advocacy for other families facing similar challenges. Billy Fire Horse's career as territorial teacher and later superintendent reflected educational opportunities Rebecca's instruction had made possible, while his advocacy for Native American children's rights demonstrated how completely he had integrated his adoptive father's cultural heritage. His policies ensuring orphan children received educational opportunities, regardless of ethnicity, created systemic changes benefiting hundreds throughout the territory. The Samuel and David Crawford who had joined as traumatized orphans grew into successful ranchers whose partnership extended the Fire Horse family's influence throughout eastern Kansas. Their own adoptions of orphan children continued the family tradition of opening hearts to youngsters needing second chances. Rebecca Fire Horse's establishment of the first territorial adoption agency grew from personal experience with bureaucratic obstacles that had nearly separated her family. Her advocacy work influenced territorial legislation, prioritizing family preservation over institutional placement, while training programs for county officials emphasized cultural sensitivity and community integration. William Fire Horse's evolution from horse trader to territorial legislator reflected community recognition that his unique perspective on intercultural cooperation provided insights frontier governance desperately needed. His legislative work, establishing legal protections for adoptive families and advocacy for Native American rights, created lasting changes extending far beyond personal circumstances. The storm cellar where 3 frightened children had hidden from an uncertain world was eventually converted into a family museum, where Fire Horse descendants preserved artifacts from their founding story. The wooden shelves that had held their meager possessions were maintained exactly as found, while photographs and documents traced the family's evolution from desperate orphans to community leaders. The Kellerman farm that had been auctioned, with 3 children as unwanted additions, became the centerpiece of a prosperous ranch operation employing dozens of families. The buildings that had sheltered the Fire Horse family were preserved as symbols of possibilities emerging when ordinary people chose to act with extraordinary compassion. The precedent established by Judge Morrison's decision influenced territorial law for decades, creating legal protections for adoptive families and procedures, prioritizing children's welfare over bureaucratic convenience. Law schools used the case as an example of how frontier justice could evolve to meet human needs when judges maintained courage and wisdom. The community that had rallied to support the Fire Horse family developed a tradition of collective action that sustained it through subsequent challenges. Networks of mutual assistance became permanent institutions, supporting other families facing difficulties, while the precedent of standing up to unjust authority inspired resistance to other forms of oppression. The 3 Prairie Waifs who had once been destined for sale with the land became the foundation of a family dynasty whose influence extended throughout the American West. Their descendants carried forward values of compassion, courage, and community service that originated in a storm cellar where love had been offered to children who had every reason to distrust adult promises. Their story became proof that families could be created through choice and commitment just as powerfully as through biology, and that bonds forged in crisis and maintained through dedication could prove stronger than those assumed through convention.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.